All right, good morning, everybody. Peter Marzano here with my first music commentary video, and it's over an event that has certainly shook up the music community within the last 16 to 18 hours or so. And there's certainly a lot to unpack because this involves probably the most controversial figure in hip hop music at the moment. Yesterday, 20-year-old Florida rapper XXXTentacion was shot and killed outside of a motorcycle dealership in Deerfield Beach, Florida. And it certainly has sent waves throughout the hip hop and music community in general. A lot of people, of course, sending their condolences to the late rapper, but also it has reignited a debate that has really been ignited within the past year, especially in wake of the Me Too movement, about separating art from the artist, which has been a really big debate, especially after all of the films that guys like Harvey Weinstein and Roman Polanski and Woody Allen, the list goes on in the film industry. But that, of course, extends into the music industry as well when you start to talk about an artist's personal life and how that affects how somebody can consume the art. And before I unpack the specifics about the allegations that were leveled at XXXTentacion throughout his short-lived career, I also think it is important that I do acknowledge the fact that I believe separating art from the artist is indeed possible. I think it's very subjective, though, and that wherever you draw the line is completely subjective and rather arbitrary. And I think if you look at something like this from a black and white standpoint, it's going to be very tough to find any consistency in what you end up listening to. And with that being said, I think specifically in the field of music, there have been so many figures throughout musical history that have had some very troubling allegations and past that have certainly affected how people view them as a person. One person in particular that often doesn't get it brought up because of how legendary he was in the music sphere was John Lennon, who was very physically abusive in his relationship with Yoko Ono, had a lot of other allegations regarding physical abuse throughout his musical career. And then you listen to his music, and this is the same person talking about imagine a world with no possessions or no religion, and appearing to be this incredibly peaceful figure when in his personal life that was very contrary to what was true. And that has gone on with a lot of artists, including a lot of artists that I personally still listen to. And I'm somebody that tries my best when consuming somebody's art to do so in an objective fashion. But there are, of course, scenarios to where that becomes very difficult to do. While I think X is one of those cases, one that was somebody that I was particularly a fan of that doesn't exactly involve music was a comedian, Louis C.K. I remember seeing him live. I was a big fan of his show, huge fan of all of his stand-up specials, but after the allegations had been leveled and after he kind of stepped out of the spotlight, because of those allegations, I think it became very difficult to separate his art from his personal life because a lot of what he said and talked about in his stand-up comedic material and in his shows was directly related to what his allegations were about. You know, he talked about jerking off in front of people, and that's what the allegations ended up being about. It's hard to take that as comedy when at the end of the day, that is what he did in real life. And I think there are a lot of really, really bad people on this planet that make really good art. I don't think X was one of those people, partially because I never really enjoyed his music to begin with. But with that being said, he did talk about a lot of real things in his music and about his struggles with mental illness and suicidal thoughts. And those were a lot of things that were recurring themes in his music. What made it tough for me personally to separate his art from the person that he was is that they were two completely different people, and he never really addressed the very serious allegations and I should say actions that were very much so confirmed in his music. That was never really part of what he brought into it. And with somebody that was such a personal artist, it just becomes very, very tough to try and separate those two things. And of course, the allegations that were levied at XXXTentacion were extremely severe, from holding a pregnant woman captive, multiple allegations of physical and sexual abuse, violent homophobia with beating a cellmate in jail at a very young age. And it's also worth noting that this individual was 20 years old at the time of his death yesterday. And I think this also brings up a number of political issues that go into him being a product of a very, very troubled environment. Specifically, when he was 6 years old, he stabbed one of his mother's violent attackers. So abuse was in his life at a very young age. And I also think it's worth noting that this is something that white people specifically really don't ever have to deal with. For the most part, we're put in environments at large that don't really have this as a norm, as a cultural norm. So I think that there's a lot of systematic issues that need to be addressed when looking at something like this, because that is kind of what allows these vicious cycles to continue. It's when abuse is part of somebody's life at such a young age that ends up becoming the norm for what ends up being their life from that point on, which is incredibly disturbing. And I think there's another conversation to be had about how to address those issues. And I think that, looking at it from that standpoint, there's a number of things that can be done that just simply haven't been done by the people in power, such as actually investing in these communities, making sure that there's adequate education for these children at a very young age, making sure that they are essentially given a chance in life, which many of them aren't. And I think that was certainly part of the case with X, was that he was raised in a very, very difficult environment and entered the criminal justice system at an incredibly young age. And I think that that's certainly something to be looked at. And I also don't want any of what I say here, at least for me, and what a lot of other people are saying regarding his death, to kind of hide the fact that at least I'm somebody who really, really does believe in rehabilitation, in giving people a second chance, in letting people recover from these problems, especially because he never really had much of a chance in that regard in the first place. With that all being said, this was a heinous and violent abuser, and I personally cannot find much sympathy in myself for his death. I think that the circumstances surrounding it and how he died were certainly very tragic. It's another horrible incident of gun violence. However, at the end of the day, it becomes very difficult to memorialize somebody like this when you're thinking about the amount of trauma that he laid on multiple victims throughout his life. There was one particular allegation that I found very, very disturbing, that he had actually punched a girlfriend for simply humming the tune to another rapper's song. There was also a tweet that was less than a year ago, in August 2017, around the time that he released his debut album 17, where I think it was some level of inflammatory tweet about him being scared or whatever, and to which X replied in a tweet, "I'm not scared to fuck your underage sister in the throat." And I really don't think he was kidding at all with something like that. And I don't think many people would doubt that either. So there are a lot of things to unpack with the high level of allegations and problems and charges that were laid on him. He was currently awaiting trial for a domestic violence charge for what he had done to that pregnant victim, which was the most notable of his allegations. And it just reignites that debate of, can you enjoy his art? If you are somebody that enjoyed his music, is that okay? And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not the person to judge that. I think that, like I said earlier in the video, it's incredibly subjective at where you draw the line between what is and isn't okay. And I think even where I draw the line is rather arbitrary, because I, like pretty much everybody else, I enjoy art from abusive and problematic artists. I mentioned John Lennon earlier, but there's a number of other artists that have had very disturbing allegations put at them, and it's trying your best to separate art from the artist and view the art objectively, but at the same time being very critically conscious of the person that they are outside of the art and how that relates to it. And I think that that's particularly relevant with people like Dr. Dre, who had a level of physical allegations leveled at him. In a recent story, Nas, who Keyless just a couple of months ago went into detail about the horror and violence that she experienced throughout her marriage with Nas. And then you even go back to people like Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. And then even in another recent story, Amir Van from Brockhampton, who had a number of very disturbing allegations of sexual misconduct levied at him, along with emotional and mental abuse. And these are very serious things that obviously need to be taken seriously. And I think first and foremost, how these events affect the victims is what needs to be looked at first and foremost. So I don't think it's worth judging anybody for enjoying art from these people, but I do think that if you're not being critically conscious of the person that they are behind the art, and especially if the art is personal and isn't really relatable to the allegations and the problems that these people have dealt with, it becomes very tough, at least for me, to separate art from the artist. And I do think that this was, of course, a pretty tragic event. It's another, like I said, another horrible incidence of gun violence in a country where that happens a whole lot and that has been a problem for quite some time. I also think it's rather disturbing that this seems to be returning to hip hop culture when it has had an absence for essentially 20 years. There's, of course, the incident with Tekashi 6ix9ine and Chief Keef a couple of weeks ago, which could have resulted in a death. And I unfortunately would not be surprised if that's a trend that continues with this up and coming generation of rappers. I also think it's notable to, putting all of that aside, you can recognize the fact that X had a lot of influence on people in his subgenre of the SoundCloud rap, of the sad boy rap that's coming up, and also that, he fused a lot of genres with the music that he made. And you can look at that and appreciate that in an objective sense. But I think at the same time, when you look at everything that had gone on in his personal life and how he essentially avoided all of this in his music, while, essentially putting himself as a victim to his mental illnesses, which I'm not trivializing at all. It's a very serious issue that a lot of people deal with. But being depressed is no excuse or contributing factor to being a heinous and violent and repeated abuser, which is unfortunately what he was. So in a situation like this, I just offer my condolences and thoughts to his victims and his loved ones. But I personally just can't find too much sympathy for the events that happened there, at least for him personally. And when I think about it more and more, I just think about his victims and everything that they had to deal with, and that is irreversible damage that they have mentally for the rest of their lives. And I also think it's worth noting that I'm not saying that, if he was alive today, that he should have been locked up or not given a second chance. I think that those things are all opportunities that people deserve. And I think that even if he would have rehabilitated and become a different person, which is, something that is needed, especially for people that are products of a very troubled and harmful environment, that does not erase the irreversible damage that was done to his victims throughout his short-lived career. And I also think it's worth noting that it was these severe allegations and these, heinous acts that contributed to him gaining a lot of this notoriety, recognition, and fame. It was actually how I found out who this guy even was last year, because of the level of abusive allegations that were put on him. And that's how I even knew who this guy was before listening to any of his music. Partially because I'm not really immersed in that subgenre of rap. But at the same time, I think it's worth noting that this was certainly something that aided in him gaining recognition and notoriety in pop culture, and specifically in hip hop culture. So my bottom line is that you can certainly appreciate the art and you can separate art from the artist. I think it would be very impossible to not do that, especially because a lot of really, really, really awful people make good art. And there's a lot of good people that make really bad art. But I think at the end of the day, the number one thing that everybody has to do, whether you personally can separate art from the artist or not, is to critically view who they were as a person or who they are as a person, and consider that when listening to their music. And I think in wake of the most recent Nas album, which I really enjoyed, I thought it was one of his better records. My biggest criticism was that he completely shied away from talking about his allegations of physical and emotional abuse in his marriage with Keyless. And it was once again a very personal album where he's going in depth and seeming so in touch with a lot of the racial issues that go on in this country, yet was so tone deaf and out of touch on what he was personally involved in. So when listening to that album specifically in that sense, I was just kind of confused. I'm like, I really enjoy what I'm hearing, and I think a lot of what he's saying is relevant, but at the same time, he's not really mentioning any of the allegations that were leveled at him in a work that is incredibly personal. So that's another case to where, I can separate art from the artist, but I have to view it critically in that sense and be like, well, none of that was really talked about. And that's something that, in my mind, negatively impacted how I view that album. And it certainly negatively impacted how I viewed a lot of X's music, because it was that times another 100 because of what a lot of his music was about. Where if you just listened to his music and had no idea who he was or what he had done, you would have a completely different picture of what this individual was. So I think it's, once again, extremely unfortunate, and I really hope that these acts of violence do not once again become a norm in the hip hop community. I think that was good that that's something that has disappeared within the last 20 years, but unfortunately, that seems to be a reviving trend. So once again, I offer my thoughts and condolences to his victims and his loved ones, but I just personally can't feel much sympathy when I think about all of his victims and what they had to go through, and not just what they had to go through, but the damage that has caused and what they will continue to go through for the rest of their lives. Just some very, very traumatic experiences. And then thinking about that, and not only does it get tough to separate art from the artist, it gets tough to really evaluate them as a person, especially because at the end of the day, everybody dies in this world and everybody has a legacy, whether it's with their close ones or whether they're famous and it's on a larger scale about who they were as a person. And I think that's something that has to be considered. And I think that at the end of the day, I think that some of the things I said in this video may have sounded kind of callous, but I just don't think it's fair to his victims to really memorialize this guy just for his art alone, even if you appreciate it when considering everything that he had done and the damage he had caused to his victims and the people that were in his life. So that's kind of where I'm at on this. Thank you for tuning in. If you did, I should have some more album reviews coming up soon. This is my first music commentary video. I might be doing some more of these, just depending on what goes on, but just wanted to offer my thoughts on this, which is a very controversial issue and something that I think will continue to confront not just in music, but in all forms of art, on if you can personally separate art from the artist, what you can enjoy. And like I said, I don't think that you're a bad person if you enjoy any of X's music or found things that were worth celebrating and worth listening to and worth thinking about in his music. But I just think at the end of the day, you have to be conscious of the person he was when listening to that. And for me, that's kind of what did it in for his music. And unfortunately, with a life that was filled with a lot of violence and a lot of really bad issues, he ended up paying the price with his life for it. And I think that at the end of the day, that in its own is pretty unfortunate. So that's kind of where I'm at. Peter Marzano with my first music commentary video. Thank you for tuning in.